So that doesn't go into this. We need a separate mic for this. You want to put, no, hold on. Test. Don't press the button. Excellent. Okay. Welcome, everyone. Let's get started. So please have a seat. This is the AI Preferences Working Group. If you're not here for AI Preferences, now is probably the best time to go. Or stay and enjoy the fun. Next slide. So we'll ask, can we get some volunteers to take minutes in the note thing? We need someone to take minutes. Anyone? Anyone? Oh, lovely. Thank you. You know where to find the notes? Fantastic. Thank you so much. Next slide. So this, hopefully folks are getting familiar with. This is the famous Note Well slide. It's a short introduction to the policies under which we hold this meeting regarding things like intellectual property and code of conduct and so forth and so on. If you're not aware of this, please do take some time to familiarize yourself with it. You can find it by going into your favorite web search engine and typing in IETF Note Well. These policies are things that we do take seriously. And if you have any questions or you have problems, especially around things like the code of conduct, first point of contact can be us as the chairs, and we can direct you in the right direction. So our agenda for today is fairly short, although we may fill all the time. We had a design team meeting last week in London on Thursday and Friday. We made some good progress in that, and so we're going to do a short recap of what happened there. And then we have some new drafts out that the editors are proposing as a result of listening to those discussions, as well as the other discussions we've had on the issues list and the mailing list. And so we're going to have an overview of both drafts and go through the open issues. The editor's going to talk about their understanding of where we're at and what we still need to work on. And then we're going to try and get another set of drafts out in the near future, I'd say. Again, we're chartered to finish this work in August, or at least submit it to the IESG. So we're getting towards the end stages, we hope. There's still some work to do, and we still need to make sure that we get good consensus on all of the documents. Next slide. There we go. So I just wanted to highlight for a moment the opener of our charter in this work to make sure we're on the same page. We're standardizing building blocks that allow for the expression of preferences about how content is collected and processed for artificial intelligence model development, deployment, and use. Undoubtedly, I think most people are aware there are a lot of diverse interests involved here, both on the content side and on the AI side. We are not here, and then this is something that I think has emerged from a lot of discussions, both at the meeting last week as well as with other folks on the side. We're not here to make policy decisions about, what is and isn't allowed on the internet in terms of crawling or use of content. That's an issue for policymakers, and so we don't want to move that needle too much. We're really just providing a framework for them to express or to use in that work. And it's something we need to keep in mind. I know that some people want to influence the outcomes one way or another, but this is not really the place to do that in terms of how the policy questions end up. So with that in place, that's our agenda for today. Let's start with a recap of what was discussed in the design team meeting last week. Suresh, do you want to?
Yeah, thanks. So we had like a couple of meetings after the last IETF meeting. So we had our first working group meeting in Bangkok at the IETF. And since then, we've had 2 interim meetings, which is like a pretty high pace. So we had a hybrid virtual meeting, hybrid meeting in Brussels with remote participation. And we also had a fully virtual interim meeting afterwards in like June. And so there's like a bunch of issues that emerged in the drafts after the adoption. And we wanted some high bandwidth mechanism to resolve at least some of the issues. And I think Martin will talk more about like the issues that got resolved. But we did have an extremely good design team meeting on Thursday and Friday. Like I see a lot of familiar faces here who are there, either physically or remotely. And as Mark said, we had like a really great cross section of the community. So we had like people representing content holders, like AI companies, like platforms, like civic society, regulators, as well as like, I would say, how would you call something like common core, like public interest groups, right, in a way? So, yeah, so online services groups. So I think we had like a really good cross-section of society who's like impacted by this. And I think one of the things, as like Mark said, right, is like anything that comes out of this is not going to be to everybody's liking, because it's kind of, a lot of the interests are not fully aligned between the people. So what we're trying to do is like do something that works for everybody and lets the the regulatory frameworks like that on top of this to have as much choices as possible, right? I think that is, I want all of you to think of it in with that hat on, like not looking for perfect, but looking for something that's good enough that we can ship quickly. So we get ahead of the regulations and make sure that the technical mechanisms for them are there. And that said, there's like most of the items had like very clear resolutions, as Martin will talk about. There's like still a couple of areas where there is, I would say, more discussion to be had. But I think we can use the time today to do that. And looking forward to the discussion. Mark, you want to add anything? Okay, thanks. Martin, you're up. Let me grant, just throw it in here. I'll grant you screen share.
I was going to say, I'm not going to be able to drive this very well standing up here, unless you want to give me a seat. All right.
I see what's happening.
You're ready.
Just going to muscle in here and give it a go.
I'll grant the privileges to you.
Use your brick.
I don't want to use any words here.
We're going to use the mic. So we had 2 days of discussions, and it turns out that most of the issues were solved in half the time, and a few of the issues took the other half of the time, which is pretty much normal. That's slide sharing. I need the other one. Try to get in queue. What's it? All right. Because it doesn't have a screen sharing option here. Do I need to join the real one? I'm on the light one. I can't skip that. What a joke. Whatever. Oh, look at that. Now I've got too many tabs. What tab is this? What's the title of this one? Issues. Oh, geez. It's coming. Oh, wrong tab. Jeez. All right. So there's not many issues left, you'll see. But first I will go through the closed issues and in reverse order. So one of the first things we talked about was the overall taxonomy of categories of use that were involved. For people following along, this is the things that you can attach preferences to. So We have our broad, high-level TDM category, which has been renamed and possibly will be renamed further. It is currently automated processing, which essentially covers all forms of automated content processing, including AI and some of the other ones. We then spoke, and then underneath that there's two AI classifications, one being a general one being one for generative AI. And so we spoke about those definitions and largely found that the definitions themselves were pretty solid. And so that's why you see these issues closed. We spoke at some length about the role of search here, and there is some new language in the document that expands upon the definition that we had without changing it materially, just to contextualize all of that.
Just to be sure that everybody's on the same page, we're using the issues list primarily as a device for the editors to track what they need to do. They're not necessarily, if an issue is closed, that's not a declaration of consensus. And certainly, you know, the way that our work style right now is that we're having discussions, including at the design team meeting. The editors are listening to those discussions and effectively making proposals in the drafts. So we still are getting to the point where we are looking to declare consensus. So part of the reason for this meeting is, of course, to gather more of that feedback for the editors to listen to.
And so if you follow through onto some of these issues, you'll see that I've made notes. Here, Paul's made a comment here, and we made some notes about what we saw the output of the design team meeting to be, and that's why you see some of these things being closed. That's not an indication that there's consensus around these necessarily, just that there is what the editors believe is enough information from the discussions that we've had to make a concrete proposal. We'll open new issues as people raise items to discuss as we go on, I guess. So what else do we talk about here? I'm just working through the system here. So we talked about the general structure of the categories of use and the fact that we had a hierarchy. There's a top level category for automated processing. Under that, there's AI training and AI use, and also the carve out for search. And so the general sense from the discussions there was that the hierarchy was not particularly controversial, so we closed that issue. Let's see, this is a bit of a hodgepodge because it's based on the time that I closed them, and that wasn't very systemic. Okay, let's go to this one, which is the question of Eurocentricity. There was a bunch of back and forth on that one, particularly in the definitions of things, but we're now at a point where I think that that's correct. And you'll notice the hierarchy questions came up a bunch of times in all of this. What else have we got? Editorial things. I think I probably need to change this so that it doesn't have editorial items in there. So I've talked about that one. I've talked about that one. I've talked about that one. There's new text in here about mapping the vocabulary to preferences, and this simply says that each one of the items has one of three values associated with it, depending on what people have or have not expressed in terms of their preference. So we talked about that one as well. In relation to the hierarchy, we talked about extensibility and the constraints under which you would be able to add new things to the grammar. New terms, for instance, were a major piece of the discussion. And so we walked through that. The major decision there was that we decided that having a registry for terms was a bit of an attractive hazard. And the general sense in the room was that an RFC was the appropriate way to expand the vocabulary with new terms. And so the document is now, I think, a page or so shorter than it used to be because I removed all the registry stuff. Okay, what other ones? I'm trying to get the low-hanging fruit. So the registry-based preferences is out. We've talked about those. There was a lot of discussion about the combination. So there's a possibility that you have robots.txt, HTTP headers, embedded metadata, each of which could have a different statement of preferences in them. And the discussion about how to combine those was another discussion that we had. We also talked about the interaction of that with registries and other forms of attachment that go in there. Ultimately, the conclusion there was that the least privileged would be the way we would do that, which is what's already in the draft, so that issue has been closed. There was an interesting discussion about robots.txt, where we went through the question of what happens if you have two different statements of preferences for the same resources on different lines of the file, which is an error, but nonetheless happens because it's the internet. And we had a discussion about that. The conclusion there was that we would be consistent with the other combination methods that we have, and not consistent with the general attitude of robots.txt, which takes a more permissive approach. So if you have an allow and a disallow at the same level in robots.txt, you would pick the allow by preference. And in this case, we take the least restrictive option, which is to say that if any one of the places says no for something, then the answer is no. And it's only yes if there are only yeses. Okay, this is where it starts getting kind of interesting, and it gets into the open issues. So I've closed this issue. It talks about the question of under what circumstances someone who has received an expression of preferences might choose to ignore that. And there were a number of things that came up during discussions that seemed particularly interesting as use cases for things like this. As examples, one of the more common examples that was given was Adobe has a product called Firefly that takes images as input to the image generation process that it has. And so those images are used as composition references or style references, and the output image will try to mimic the various aspects of that input image. And Adobe has made the decision to respect preferences in that interface. And so if someone provides an image that has an indication that it shall not be used for inference, or that they would prefer that it not be used for inference, then Adobe will respect that and not use the image. And there's a lot of discussion about that in the sense of computer says no, and the rights of individuals that may in some cases override the preferences of those providing it. That gets into questions of things like the use of AI for accessibility. It gets into questions of whether the exemptions under law, EU copyright law for research activate, and how the preferences interact with that. There are a number of open questions in law about these sorts of things, and so we end up in a situation where the law is muddy, and so the situation ends up being quite muddy from the perspective of different applications. And so there's text now in the document that talks about the limits of what preferences mean. I think you'll see another issue here at some point. It's probably further down. We need to make it clear that these are preferences, and that sort of ties into the same sort of discussion. So you will see that there are always cases where the interests of the entity that's using the content or the assets will have interests that override the interests of those who have expressed a preference, particularly when we don't necessarily know who's expressing preferences. So that's a separate problem.
I think like the other thing that also came up was like translation. So we went into some kind of discussion about translation, whether it's generative or not, into the same thing, right?
Right, that's been a lot of
whether
time.
that's permitted. So I think this is like Martin said, it's a bit fraught, and steering away from this is a good thing. Yeah,
and a particular example of that is where the preference says that the content not be usable, but there's a contract in place between the entity using that and rights holders, for instance. So if you think about the case of Reddit, Reddit has a robots.txt file that says no one can crawl the site. I think it's very, very short presently. But they have signed deals with a number of AI companies for the access to their content. And so those contracts, in those cases, override any preferences that are indicated that way. So we've also clarified that in the text as well. Another major change, we have refined the names and the labels that we've used on each of the categories. So you'll see in the document there's some proposed new names. The top level one, I think, is an open issue, and you'll see that in the open issue list, because we think that one's probably a bit wrong. We didn't have a lot of time to discuss, and so put something in, and on reflection, that doesn't seem to work out. There were a number of pieces of dead text, which is basically what most of these things relate to. Paul asked a question about whether or not you can say nothing, and the answer is yes, you can say nothing, which has the effect of, well, nothing as it happens, and now the document even says that. There's discussion about alternative syntaxes. So we're defining an exemplary syntax for the vocabulary, which means that it's a string that you can produce in a very simple form, but there is already a number of other mechanisms that have different spelling out there in existence, and the decision relatively early on, I think, was to recognize that those are essentially providing a different representation of the same underlying model that we're operating on. And so now we've gone through the sort of exercise of saying that if you have one of those, if you define a clear and unambiguous mapping from whatever it is that you say into the model that we have, then you're effectively using this model and would be able to interoperate with things. And then that allows you to do things like the combining we were talking about. So the combination is written out in terms of the way that the model operates rather than the specific spelling. I talked about that already. You'll need to write an RFC if you want a new one. And that one there, I don't know what I think this was just closed because this was just editorial work largely. And now we're going back in prehistory. So that one was closed a long time ago, so I don't need to really talk about that as an update because people are here. What else? This one is talking about expansion of the grammar to talk about, or the vocabulary to talk about uses that were sort of negative uses, in the sense that rather than positively saying yes or no to something like AI training, you would say yes or no to something like, can this be used for weapons development, or can this be used for medical research, or maybe not medical research, commercial purposes. There are a bunch of things that have come up in discussions, and those have not come up recently. So I think the editors have concluded that maybe we can see if that comes up during further discussion. So that goes through most of the
I think, Martin, the time of crawling versus time of use.
I'm going to talk through vocabulary first. There's a couple of open issues on the vocabulary. We spent a very long time talking about inference and the bounds of that. There was a lot of discussion about trying to find a way to narrow the definition and shrink fit it to some of the different applications. And so there were two angles on that. I think there's a lot of interest in RAG generally, and we discussed at some length text that would narrow the definition to only talk about content that was autonomously retrieved. And I think this kind of relates back to the discussion just previously about the overriding of preferences based on more higher priority interests on the part of users. So the desire there was to have the definition be narrower such that when a user deliberately provides a specific piece of content, either as the bytes of the content or by a direct URL to that content, the model would not be bound by an opt-out for inference or use, because it would be directly provided rather than content that's autonomously obtained by the model as part of its operation. So the model choosing the content that it goes off and finds and then ingests. And so that remains a difficult one. The other angle that we had on that one was the split between sort of generic inference, where you have models that operate at various levels, and generative applications, and that was another line that was proposed that we used there to sort of narrow the scope of that. The challenge there, of course, is that it's not clear what generative is, and as Suresh pointed out, the question of translation appears to be a contested one, whether that's generative or not, which is kind of interesting. So that discussion continues on. We did learn a few things in the course of that discussion, and I think this was already in the draft, but a good reminder. We are able to take a very broad category and define a narrower category later on. We are not able to define a narrow category and define a broad category later on because of the way that works with the hierarchy. To give an example of that, if you define a narrow category and someone says yes or no based on that category, that's fine. But then when the introduction of a higher level category comes along that sits above that, it depends on whether you understand that high level category as to what the outcome of the statement for the lower level one is, particularly in the case when no statement is made about the narrower one. So if someone says something about the broader one with the expectation that then that cascades down to the narrower application, if something doesn't understand the broader one, then it picks up something from an even broader category above the overarching all processing category. And so that does sort of constrain the choices that we have available to us in terms of how we build out that sort of part of the vocabulary. And of course, I mentioned the name of the top level group. So I think this is probably a good spot to stop to have a brief discussion about where we're at. Maybe give people an opportunity to collect some thoughts, but I'll leave that to the chairs. So, in terms of reference.
So just about for now, the vocabulary document. Any questions about where we're at? I mean, obviously, we just had a new draft dropped very few hours ago. So we're people need some time to read that, think about where we're at. And as we're hearing, that is still work in motion. I know a lot of the text is still a little bit rough, and we need to fine tune it. So this is not in any way final. But if folks have any immediate questions about kind of the current state of the drafts or those issues that Martin pointed out in the vocabulary.
Yeah, thanks. And Arno, can you join the on-site tool so we can manage the queue? Yeah, thank you.
Sorry, and please use data tracker to queue. Yeah. Yeah,
thanks. Alyssa, you're up first. Yeah, thanks. If you're in the room, please join the on-site tool. It's important for us because we get a right-sized room next time. If you don't join, we might get a small room and you may not be able to get in. So thank you. Alyssa, thanks.
Yeah, I just have a question about the process here. So you're not actually interested in having discussion on any of these open questions now? You're only asking if people...
No, sure, we can talk about them.
Oh, okay. I have a lot. Where should we start?
All of it.
So, I'll pick up on something that you just ended with. This question about generativity. That seems like something that needs to be resolved for this document anyway, because there's a generative AI training category. So if that's the reason that we can't come to a decision about that specific case, it's also a problem for your generative AI training definition. Like, it's already there, so does it cover translation or not? Like,
yeah, so I think part of the discussion there was we concluded that it would be necessary for us to resolve, I think, some examples of different things in that regard. And I think translation is probably the most difficult one, because it sits at that cusp of, well, it is generative in the sense that it performs many of the functions that a generative model does, but it is not transformative, or it doesn't create new content in a sense. But then neither does rewriting it in some ways, neither does summarization. Where does the line end on these things? And it's very vague. So I think having a couple of examples to help illustrate that is part of that. And we did discuss several times during the course of the discussion having a separate document that provides a bunch more context outside of the core definitions. We want to keep the core definitions relatively clean, even though it's kind of getting long already, but provide a whole lot more contextualization about how this fits into the broader context and what it means to express preferences and that sort of thing. And this was one of the ones that I think was contentious. But I don't think there was too much contention aside from where that line was precisely around translation. I think was the cut point that we have. Yeah.
Okay.
And that was, I remember, quite a long discussion with, I think, reasonable positions on both sides. The other aspect here, that there is a little bit of a difference that came up in that for training, it's about, are you training with the intent of creating a model with a capability of being generative?
Yes.
Whereas on the inference, or I think we're calling it use now, side, it's whether the specific instance of use is generative, and there's a slight semantic difference there potentially. That was one of the things we covered.
Yeah, that's fair. But I think if you end up using the word, then you're going to have to take a position. So yeah.
I think the other thing was so one question was is there anything in AI that's not generative, right? That was another question that kind of came up, right? And so we kind of talked about this a bit as well. And one of the things that was very clearly not there was classification stuff. So imagine you feed a whole bunch of content with something to classify stuff. So that's certainly not generative.
Yeah.
So I think that's why we kind of need another category, because people said, why do we need something else? Because most of the things we care about are this.
Yeah. I mean, I think, and I really apologize that I wasn't there last week. So if I'm just saying things that were already said, it feels like the general principle of being motivated by the use case is a good one here. So if there are sufficient number of people who actually want to signal a separate preference for translation that is going to be different from the rest of what they signal for AI use, then that would be a good reason to have a carve out the same way that we do for search. Maybe you already talked about this, but.
Yeah, translation is an interesting one because it may be one of those ones that we don't have preferences for because it's always acceptable to use these tools for the purposes of
Right.
accessibility.
Yeah.
And so translation accessibility, I know, again, there's another fine line there, but we may be able to say that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that makes the definition of generative cleaner, if that's the case.
I think it does, because that one sits right on the line. I think there may be other examples that we find come out through all of this. There is text in the document right now that basically says that we're not the entity that's making the determination as to whether a particular category applies to their application will have to do so based on an understanding of that application and an understanding of the categories, and that there may be no bright line in some of those cases. And so we are acknowledging the possibility that there are gray areas in this, and to some extent we're relying on the people who are building the products to make that final decision. And I guess ultimately perhaps courts in certain jurisdictions will be making those determinations, which is where it gets kind of well out of our domain. So some level of imprecision I think we can manage, but I think we'll need to take a look and see if you think that the definitions we have are bad, and we'd very much like suggestions about how to sharpen them.
Okay, yeah, I mean, I do think in general, in the terminology section or whatever it's called at the top, there's some things missing that could be helpfully added. Like generative AI is not actually separately defined. It's just you just use it. And the same thing for search applications. So I think there's some more terms that having crisp definitions outside of where they get used later in the document would be helpful and give us a focal point for, for coming to conclusion on those. Similarly, I think the part about overriding, like it's worth just enumerating all of those cases that we already know about, even though it's non-exhaustive, in like a very, in a bulleted list or whatever. So instead of just saying like, well, one is, accessibility and another one might be research. It's like, we know what some of them are, like, let's just say what they are, even though it's going to be context dependent. Yeah.
So help on that would be useful. I've got a couple in there, but I think I think it would be good, as you say, to have a more complete list, even if it's not ever going to be complete. Yeah.
Thanks.
Alyssa, did you have other points, or that's enough for now?
I'll come back, talk about search.
Cool.
Right, Arnaud Tadei, Broadcom. Sorry for missing the raised hand earlier. So the question I have is on the definition again. You have a definition of AI in the vocab .md file. I forgot the name on the GitHub. The question I have is, have you looked at other SDOs, what they do? Because there is a lot of definition that exists for plenty of words. I don't see
dictionaries, yeah, dictionaries work pretty well too.
Yes, but have you? How did you come up with this definition for AI at the moment?
I read the dictionary.
Okay, fair enough. I could have made the same answer, Martin. Thank you. That's very helpful. The point is that there is a lot of colleagues that are working on definitions. They compile a lot of words. You may want to use that, unless you say, we are IETF, we are arrogant, and nobody else exists. You can keep this line if you want, Martin. But there are other people who work on that. We are going to have a lot of conflicts and a lot of problems of coordination with other SDOs at the moment. So if you do not want to make an effort, just say it. Otherwise, we could help, period.
So Arnaud, is there some definitions you can send to the list? Specifically that we can put in for this?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
We could.
Thank you.
Thank
Please,
you.
thank you. Irum?
Yes, can you hear me? Aram Welling?
Yeah.
Great,
Thank you.
Oxford Information Labs. So I have a couple questions, please.
If you can get a little bit closer to the mic.
Yes. Is that any better?
Slightly, yeah. Thank you.
Okay, great. So I'll just try to talk louder. Yeah, I think, Arnaud brought up a good point. I think, but I can also understand that you need people to provide you input. You may not be able to scan the world. So I think, maybe we can help you out there with what's going on in other SDOs. Okay, so my questions, I have 3 of them, please. The first one relates to the comment that was made about contracts perhaps trumping other ideas for what is presented. For example, information, you mentioned entities using contents, you mentioned external parties expressing their preferences as to whether that content is usable, yet you said that contracts can override perhaps those. And the thought that comes to my mind is that contracts can exist, for example, between companies and governments, right? Contracts can exist. However, is that appropriate to utilize that contract? Say, for example, that company is now going to utilize AI to present content. Well, just because they have a contract with a company, with a government, that somehow that's going to trump the let's say popular citizens' views of information being not presented, for example. So if you're dealing with this, I understand at the very beginning you said, there's some areas we're just not going to get into, we're going to leave that to the policy. But when you start diving into contracts, you can, get yourself caught up in policy real quick. So I was wondering, that's my first question. Could you please address that one, what your thoughts are on contracts that are perhaps related to people who directly develop policy? Thank you.
So I don't think the intent here is to say that any contract in the world could override this framework or the preferences expressed. It's more that it's an example of one of those external considerations that you need to take into account when evaluating preferences, because again, we're coming from the standpoint that this framework is merely expressing preferences. And for those who weren't here from the beginning, we started with naming this effort AI control because we wanted to control the behavior of AI crawlers online. And one of the very first things we realized is that doesn't make any sense. We don't have the means to control their behavior technically. And what we do here has to operate within a much larger framework that is dependent upon the jurisdiction that it's applied within. And so I would take the mention of contracts more as an example of if there's a contractual relationship between a provider of information and an AI vendor, then of course the terms of that contract dictate the relationship. And part of that contract could be, well, don't worry about the preferences because we know each other, for example. And I think that's the nature of the example. So maybe it needs a little bit more weight on it to explain that rather than just saying contracts. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does actually. Thank you. That does clarify it well. So I appreciate that. Yeah, and if that's somehow translated to writing, that would be great too. Okay, next question is you were talking about content autonomously retrieved by the model as the preference, as opposed to something that's more of a direct feeding from a particular entity. So I wanted to ask about accessibility related to that. If you're talking about autonomous retrieval, now you're talking about what the model has permission to access, and that can be limiting as well, right? So what were your thoughts on that topic?
Yeah, so the document doesn't presently make any distinction about automated retrieval. That was one of the things that remains sort of open in the discussion around use. And so certainly the question of accessibility is core to this, but I think it comes back again, at least when it comes to accessibility, it comes down to probably one of these cases where the interests of those who are seeking the accessibility end potentially override the preferences. Potentially, I say, because I don't know all of the circumstances, and it will depend, I suspect. So we don't presently have anything in there, but if there's something that you think we need to have, now's a great time to try to sharpen that up. I think probably, when I say now, I mean write an email to the mailing list probably, because this is a difficult problem and will require some thought and consideration, and probably not within the next 10 minutes.
Yeah. And just to add a little more to that, I think this is a thread through both of your questions so far. One of the things that emerged from last week's meeting is that we've had this intent to make sure that this is really seen as just a preferences framework that is not an algorithm to determine whether or not you can use content online, that you can just run it and you're done. We need to do, it's become blindingly obvious, we need to do a lot better job explaining that and contextualizing this so people are clear on what the very limited function of what we're providing here is.
Yeah, thanks. And Iram, like just one more thing, there's some text at the end of section 3.1, right? Like, the accessible stuff that I posted. So if you can propose to Martin's thing, right? If you want to propose anything additional to that, that is kind of it actually directly addresses the accessibility stuff you talked about. So if you think that text can be improved, like that would be a good place to start.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And I will definitely utilize some of these resources that have been provided. Okay, sorry. One more question, if I could, please. This is about, as we're talking about all this, you almost start to formulate the idea of AI, whatever it develops, is almost like a research paper, right? Or whatever, because you're reaching out to all these bits of information, and you're aggregating that into some kind of output. So in a sense, it's like a research. So typically when you have research, you provide the back end sources that you hit on to develop that output, right? That research. So do you foresee perhaps this concept of providing some legitimacy to the output by providing perhaps some source information on whatever's developed as the output? Thank you.
So there have been some discussions, especially before we chartered, there's definitely interest in the community about measures for things like transparency and audit trails, but that's outside the scope of our current charter. We wanted to deliver these very basic components as quickly as we could. Having said that, once we deliver those, we can have a discussion about rechartering and taking on different kinds of work, but that's not a decision that we can make right now.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Ronnie?
Hi. First of all, I want to thank all the group and the great work that's being done here. But I wanted to take it to a different level, maybe talk something more general level. I've been with the IETF just for the last year and a half, so a young newbie here. So there's a lot of discussion about the robots.txt and how to implement it with the robots.txt. Well, basically, robots.txt is not working. It's not working, and Bruce Tokale, the founder of the Internet Archive, just said so the other day in the AIPREF group. And I think it's something that we need to think about. Most of the data scraping in general is not for AI, but AI is the game changer that we seem to try to follow and keep up with. Not sure that we are succeeding so much. And I think that's because the AI revolution is changing the internet completely. It transforms it. And as always, people are fearing this kind of change and not knowing how to address it. And this is something that we're trying to keep up, but the last year and a half, we might have missed that train, and we are seeing things on a weekly basis that are changing while we keep talking about the vocabulary and the terminology and those kind of things. But actually, at the end, from at least the wording we have now, I think we're actually creating legal rights that don't really exist yet. And
can I interrupt you just for 1 second?
Sure.
Because I like what you're saying. The comment is good, but we are on the vocabulary part. So there's like 2 drafts we have, right? And I think from what you said, your comment is for the attachment draft, which concerns the robots and the HTTP headers and stuff like that. So go ahead and finish it, but I really want you to bring it up, like in the context of the other one. And I do want to dispute one thing, that we are creating a legal right. We are not, right?
No.
So so as long as that's not a misconception, we can continue on.
So I think that is one of the main thing. We are talking about the technicalities, the vocabulary, the terminology, but I want to take it to the higher level, again, from my perspective, because I think it is important. And although we are saying we are not creating legal rights, there are numerous cases where the IETF standards have been used in different regulatory and policies and so on. So we're not supposed to ignore it. We know what we're doing, and this can be relevant from that perspective. I think also their vocabulary, the opt-in, opt-out, and other terminology is even creating some sort of discrimination between the good bot, bad bot, allowing some people or some users and blocking others. And at the end, is something, and this was just answered by Mark, influence the market, because when you say, yeah, if there's a contract between a company and right holders, then that contract will be what they need to follow through. That will mean that the big companies will have the option to pay big money in order to get that information, while the medium and small ones won't have it. So I think those things are even, again, only a year and a half with the IETF, even goes against what the IETF is trying to do, an open, decentralized web and internet. And sometimes we need to stop and think whether where we're at now is where we want it to be, or perhaps what we started with is no longer relevant.
So a question and then hopefully a response. I hear what you're saying. You started off by talking about robots.txt, but I'm assuming that your concerns are not limited just to the use of robots.txt. It's an overall architectural question, correct?
Yeah, I'm not going to the technicality.
If we put it in a different file, it's not going to make a difference to you, is it?
No, but
Okay.
the fact that you're using something that is already, I'll exaggerate and say obsolete in terms of it's not maintained, it's usually not really updated with the actual preferences of the website. Technical people will use it. So it's just an example of how we are fixed on the technicalities, what file to put it, rather than maybe there's a different way of looking at it. And
so I hear your concerns, and I certainly share some of them. I think that's a very interesting discussion to have, and one that the IETF should have in the context of some other work. In the context of this particular work, I think our charter is fairly clear, and we've already had the chartering discussion. So I'm not sure it's going to be productive to use this working group's time. I do think that it's a discussion that the community needs to have overall. And maybe we need to look for a venue for that discussion, especially around, I think you touched a little bit on centralization aspects there. That's really key.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and I do have one more thing. So you talked about opt-in and opt-out. Those texts have been removed from the draft. If you look at the 02 draft that Martin published today, it does not have any other language. Because I think part of the thing is the opt-in and opt-out is part of some like regulatory regime that's sitting on top of this. It's not us. And as you say, right, like, technology has like some values embedded in it, right? Like, and we are not trying to avoid that issue completely. But if we don't provide this common vocabulary and tools, like every jurisdiction is going to go about doing their own thing, right? And that's kind of what we're trying to avoid, to provide this set of tools. But like that discussion you talked about still needs to be had, but it's happening like one layer above us, right? And if there's anything you think that's in the draft that's making things worse on the outcomes on the other side, that's something we'd certainly like to hear.
I think just an example going from the TDM to the, I think the last automated, I can't recall, it's exactly the type of things that might be, okay, hey, it's more clearer that way, but that will have substantial consequences at the end when that might roll up to the legislators and so on. Same thing with, I think there's in the recent draft, there's consumption of, instead of use, it was consume data. Again, those are small, and again, I don't want to get into the technicalities because I think we should just understand the importance of every such change while everything is going around us regarding AI. So consumed versus used, and for me, it's about the higher level, not the specifications.
I checked the latest draft. There's been substantial changes, and it was only published a couple of hours ago, so that may be overcome by events.
Okay, thank you.
Let's continue the discussion, but not here. We need a better venue, I think, because it is. I agree, it is an overarching issue rather than just specific to this work.
Thanks.
Thank you. Alyssa? Martin, are you having issues? No. Okay.
So back onto the search topic. I am curious about kind of the status of where people's heads are with the new AI use category and the search category. So if I am a site and I say AI use no, search yes, and then the consumer of this information generates like some sort of summarized or generated text, let's say, and then links directly to my site, is that aligned with the preferences that the site expressed, or is it not aligned? You actually don't know the answer.
Yeah.
Okay, well, we
You
found
stepped
out
in
what
it.
I wanted to find out.
My understanding, which I'm sure someone will correct me if I'm wrong, is we're at a place where the intent of the current search category is to provide an explicit carve out so that someone who wants to disallow TDM or AI, Gen AI, something like that on their site, but still allow search indexing can have certainty that they're not going to accidentally turn off search on their site when they disallow something at a higher level there. It is not currently intended to provide that fine-grained control of, I want to control the search user experience and say whether it can summarize or not, for example.
Which means the summary is allowed.
So I believe in the current language, a summary would be allowed, or at least that's how some will interpret it. We did have a discussion about this, I think on, was it Thursday? And there certainly was some interest in that. And we also heard, at least from some of the search vendors in the room, the expression that, well, we already provide controls for this. And so maybe the next phase of that discussion is, well, if you already provide controls for it, can we standardize one? But as chair, I express some discomfort about getting too far out of our charter scope in terms of defining search controls, but this is an AI involved use case. So, arguably it could be in our charter too. So this is all very TBD. We haven't gotten there yet.
Yeah, the definition that we have there, and I guess I can probably zoom in it even more, is very much a positive framing. So if the application directs users to the location from which the assets were retrieved, then it qualifies as a search application. Now the question is whether we see material impacts from things like AI overviews as changing the nature of the application such that it no longer qualifies as directing users toward the location of the assets. That is, I think, the point on which that will hinge. And I don't think that we have any clear answer on that.
Okay, so this is just like unresolved, basically.
Largely
Yeah.
unresolved.
Okay, that's helpful. I'm trying to remember what I had one other question, which I will come back with when I recall what it is. Thanks.
Queues are open.
Andrew?
Hi, Andrew Campling. Oh gosh, that's loud. 419 Consulting. Two quick points. One, I think we can confidently assume that politicians can make stupid decisions with or without any output from this working group. So I don't think we should trouble ourselves too much on that. And then perhaps slightly more seriously, on the general decentralization, centralization point, rather helpfully, the DINRG research groups meeting in this room in the next session. So maybe carry that point into there. But there you are.
I suspect a lot of people will disappear for WebBot auth in the next session. So.
We drain the queue. All right.
The queue is drained. Iram, you can just sign up on the mailing list if you're hearing me. So just sign up on the list and start contributing.
Yep. So let's go to briefly touch on the attachments. Okay, so we didn't spend anywhere near as much time on the question of attachment. You'll see that there's nowhere near as many issues, and they were nowhere near as contentious. One of the oldest issues we have is the question of the time at which particular set of preferences apply, particularly in the case of robots to text, where you have one resource over here saying something about another resource over here, and they may be fetched at different times. And it may be the case that the robots.txt updates and the preferences update at a different sort of cadence to the resource itself. And so I think the discussion there was very crisp and clear. The outcome was that when you obtain a resource or an asset, the robots.txt that was active at that time, according to the caching rules in RFC 9309 and HTTP, that document applies to that, and those preferences then attach to that asset. And so if you use that asset 10 days later, when robots.txt might have been updated in its original location, that doesn't matter. It's the time of acquisition that determines what's going on. And so if it's in the interests of the entity that's consuming those assets, that they want updated information about preferences, then they can go off and retrieve that information, or at least reconfirm. There's methods you can use in HTTP just to confirm that you have the same copy of the thing that you had in the past. And we would probably insist that people use those. There's new editorial changes in here, but this document has not changed a great deal. So we're making clear the distinction between the acquisition of bytes and the application of preferences to those bytes. And those are two things that we have distinct actions. So robots.txt presently governs whether you can obtain something from a crawler. The addition that we're making says, if you can obtain something, these are the preferences that apply to those things. And it may only be to a subset of the resources that you obtain that have preferences. And of course, we explain that no preference is no preference, because no preference is no preference. It's pretty straightforward. So there's an opportunity to talk about the location attachment and the appropriateness of this tool for the task, but I believe that's settled consensus. If I'm reading that right from the chairs, we've talked about whether robots.txt was the right thing to do from the very outset of these efforts, and I think we keep confirming that it is each time we discuss it. So I think that has been resolved.
Yeah, I think we'd need some compelling new information. That new information may come in the form of, lots of people saying,
sure.
Yeah, but yeah, there's kind of an assumption there. We'll talk a little bit about where we're at the end.
Yeah,
next steps.
And if somebody wants a different one, please come up with a proposal too, like an alternate proposal on how to go about doing it, right? Because I think it's important. Just saying this is not the best thing, it's not very productive. So please do come up with another proposal. Thank you.
So there is one issue that I think we talked about. We talked around, I think, a little bit at the meeting last week. We did talk about the second one, but because it's got this applicability statement label on it, we're leaving that open because we want to have a more nuanced discussion about that one, a bit more context setting. But in terms of location attachment, actually, I can just do this. That is no longer a problem for that document. We now identify the ways in which we think that attachment is going to work, and we're fairly confident that that's the right set. We talked about that. The difficult one, again, is that the syntax itself, we didn't get deep into the weeds in terms of how it works and whether there were potentially alternatives that were superior. I know that there's some ideas floating around. I think, again, this is one of those cases where if we come up with a superior design, then we'll probably take that. But it would have to come with a compelling set of advantages over what we have presently. Or a list of deficiencies in the present arrangement that would lead you to conclude that a change in design is necessary.
Any discussion on attachment? This is maybe the slightly more boring deliverable. So,
yeah, as a number of people have said throughout the discussion, we can spell this any way we like, but it's the vocabulary that matters. And,
Jeff Romado. Sorry, I didn't read the document. I need to do that, especially onto the attachment. But have you thought about the ability for the...
Sorry, could you get a bit closer?
Yeah, sorry. So I didn't read it, sorry for that. But do you have a mechanism for like the propagation of the preferences? So like having like a continuous attachment if it goes through multiple hops? Because AI can be consequences of multiple requester and caller the one into the other. And sometimes the farther you go from the requester, the less context you can have. But for preferences, it might be important to keep that.
So for our initial work, we've decided to just describe two attachment mechanisms through robots.txt and in an HTTP header and describe how they work together. But there is a very conscious accommodation of the potential for other attachment mechanisms to be defined in the future. We just wanted to define the minimum viable thing that we can ship in a reasonable amount of time. And so that's why we're taking that approach. But there's been a lot of discussion about the potential for either embedding preferences in content, for example, or having registries, for example, that people can use to attach the preferences. So that's something we do have in mind for the future.
Yeah, and Jeff, when you talked about multi-hop, right? Like, one of the use cases we consider is like this common, what we call the common crawl use case, where the person who crawled the data is not the person who's going to be using the data like in some of the time, right? So the idea is that like the preferences that were expressed to them are captured and conveyed. So that is something that we verified was something that was happening. So the crawler is actually separate from the person who uses it. So that is actually addressed.
Yeah, and sometimes the crawler of the data is an AI by itself. So that's why that.
So that's a common crawl use case. So the common crawl people kind of said that the robuster text in the headers like would be maintained and passed along. Thanks.
Tommy Jensen, unaffiliated. So right now the columns have a binary value, yes or no. And the discussion in the chat brought up that we might need a enum rather than a Boolean. For example, if you're saying that we want to control, hypothetically, that says you can or cannot link to this content when you summarize it in an AI view, like you're allowed to run it through and display a summary. No, I don't want you linking to this. I'm not sure why. Or yes, you may link to this, but also yes, you must. Like if you're going to summarize this, you have to source it. That I just want to point out, maybe it would be worth having that be multiple value flexible and not just a yes, no, because we don't know what all these categories will imply.
So actually, it is effectively an enumeration. So it's the framework it's relying upon is structured fields, and a Boolean in structured fields is not that. So they're actually tokens that you're seeing right there.
Okay.
We also have an extensibility story around parameters as well, and that gives you considerable flexibility there.
Perfect.
Yeah. And the thing to remember here again, Tommy, is that we're trying to limit the initial set of vocabulary that we put out there so that it is maximally compatible and comprehensible to people. Once we start getting into these finer grades of things, it's more and more specialized. And we do recognize that there are these possibilities. There have been a number of proposals made throughout the process, but we've said not now, maybe later for those.
Fair enough. So then I guess I would suggest, if we want to leave the complication for later, that's fine. But something that would be future proofing is that right now we have yes, no, and maybe we make that cannot or must not may, because that's what it really means, right? The yes is a may, the no is a must not. And then we can add things later, but.
I think adding to the enumeration would be dangerous and would lead to some very awkward situations when it comes to extensibility. So I'm not a big fan of that idea. But if you want to work up a proposal, we can talk about it. I suspect that the answer will continue to be no on that front. However, these are probably use cases that are best accommodated with extensions to the model rather than changing in the core.
And Common Crawl, by the way, has already made a proposal along those lines using parameters.
Thank you.
Or was that Creative Commons?
Sorry, you're right. Creative Commons. I get them confused.
Just to respond a little bit on that one question, I think this is somewhat clear, but the reason that you would not want to link is like for correctness. So summary says monkeys landed on Mars and then links to my news website, which is reporting that ponies landed on Mars. You do not want to be linked, right? It's like tarnishing your brand quality. So that's why this control matters and why the association with like any summary, even if it wasn't based on my content, could be problematic.
Thanks, Alyssa. I think like that is certainly a concern that some of the publishers have expressed, like whether there's some transformative stuff that happens. Yes. And like I think that your search thing comes back to that, like what amount of transformation they can do on this text, right? To still have some fidelity to the original text that came in.
Yeah.
Frank?
Yeah, just a high-level question. Have you considered how that translates into tool calling for AI models? Like, could we do something similar for MCP?
Sorry, you said that, and I don't know what that is. I lost context.
So the attachment could go and carry over to documents that you retrieve over an API that is hidden behind a natural language interface, like with MCP.
Sure.
So I think that could go and carry across. Has that been considered?
I think that would probably be considered another attachment mechanism.
Yeah, exactly. That's
Yeah.
what I would refer to.
Yeah. Again, we've tried to choose a really minimal set just to make this.
No, I
work.
get that. Right? I just was wondering
Sure.
whether it was discussed.
Not explicitly,
Okay.
but that's a natural line of thinking, certainly.
Thank you.
We need to prove this thing actually works first. Yeah. Thank you. Should we talk about next steps now?
Yeah, I'll sit down.
Okay. Thank you, Martin. I'll stay over here for
Thanks, Martin.
convenience. As you've heard, we had a couple of new drafts just this morning, or perhaps early this afternoon, depending on what time zone you're in. So folks need to go out and have a look at those. I expect that we are going to have another set of drafts in the near future as they get further refined. You heard perhaps mentioned briefly there an applicability statement. This is another deliverable we've talked about, and we've realized that it is very easy to misunderstand. Even in the people who've been in the room, it's very easy to understand the function of and the nuances of what we're providing here. So we need a document that explains that to people, especially I think to policymakers. So we've started to noodle on that. Expect to see some proposals around that sometime very soon. So depending on how the discussions go on this set of drafts and the next set of drafts we see, I think we'll have a choice. If we think the editors and chairs think that we've addressed all the open issues, we may try to go to working group last call relatively soon once we iterate on the text some more. And the function of that mostly being to try and put a stake in the ground and say, okay, here's what we think is done. Let's identify what issues are remaining or where there are still points of contention. And then move from there. We know that our first working group last call may fail, although I love being surprised. If we don't get to the point where we think we've closed all the issues, we may start doing some consensus calls individually, but expect to see more of that in the next couple of weeks. If you remember, we are chartered to finish in August, or sorry, to send these documents to the ISG in August. I would like to keep to that schedule, at least in spirit. And so if we're not able to get through working group last call in the relative future, near future, I think we'll schedule at least an online interim in the near future. And it may be during some people's holiday periods, for which I apologize. And if need be, we'll schedule another hybrid face-to-face, and it'll be a proper face-to-face. And right now, just discussing with the editors and chairs about what makes sense for that, we're kind of looking at the late September, early October timeframe, which is, as you might notice, after August. But hopefully that will be kind of our wrap up if we need it. I would love to not need to have that meeting, but that's our current thinking. That will, of course, meet reality, and then we'll see where we're at. Any questions, comments? We're in a little bit of an indeterminate state, I think, right now, because one of the things, as I said before, that really came out at the meeting last week was we need to do a better job of writing down how this framework works and what it means in the bigger picture. Like, we've got the technical details getting there, but we need to let people understand how it actually works in a larger scope, including for policymakers. And once we get that written down, I'm hoping that that will give a lot of people a lot more comfort about what we're actually delivering here and what we're working with, and then we can have a better discussion.
Yeah.
Anything to add?
Yeah. So I think if you have a keen eye, you notice that we don't have a deliverable for that. So like this could be something that Mark and I just spin up and write a draft, or like put it on a wiki or something, kind of to maintain it for now, right? And then figure out the disposition. And the other thing, quite a few people have asked, like, hey, I'm new to this working group. Sure, welcome. Thank you for coming. And if you have any comments on the draft, state as it is, right? The draft 2 is published today. So please feel free to comment on things, ask questions. You may not always get the answers you want, but please do ask the questions, because like sometimes it helps us understand if there's any weakness in our, like the way we interpret things. And we're always like willing to listen in case there's anything new that comes up. So, but there has been quite, like a lot of the stuff we've done is like very difficult stuff because we do see a lot of people with varying interests. So like a lot of words are tortured, like Martin really and Paul, like everybody has worked on like putting specific words. So please do come up with like alternatives or what exactly your concerns are. We would greatly appreciate it. So thank you very much for your input and thanks for coming.
Thanks. We're done.